We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build a decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. I wanted to better understand what we mean by digital grid. We hear that term all the time. But how does it operate? How does it affect utilities and what they do in this new energy landscape? And of course, what does it mean to distributed energy? Our favorite topic here on this show. So I spoke to Ruben Llanes, who is the Chief Technology Officer of one of the larger energy technology companies, Schneider Electric. Ruben had just celebrated his 1-year anniversary in the job, and he had some interesting insights about what electric grids are today and where they're heading. Enjoy the conversation. Hello, Ruben. Thanks for being
Hello.
here. How are you today?
Thank you. Very good. Pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. So tell us about what you do and your career journey that brought you to this place, being the CEO of Digital Grid at Schneider.
It's an interesting question. I don't spend much time talking about myself in this way, but let me try to encapsulate kind of my journey thus far. So I think like many people, my journey is a mix of both intention as well as serendipity. And I'll kind of tell you why I think that is. Growing up, my father actually owned an electrical contracting business. So I've been in and around the energy management space for almost my entire life. So straight out of university, my first professional job was with Deutsche Bank. And so Deutsche Bank, for there, I worked as in a bulge bracket investment bank covering industrials. And then within that, automotive. And I did everything from capital raising, M&A advisory work. And I'll kind of draw some parallels here with what I think that I'm doing now at Schneider Electric, in that in the 9 years that I was at Deutsche Bank, I got to see everything from the analog version of automobiles. And by the time that I left, we were starting to talk more and more about telematics and about e-mobility at that time. And so I start to see the exact same arc happen while I was at Schneider Electric, where you had assets that were not connectable and not intelligent to progressively starting to add more and more layers of intelligence as time went on. Then after leaving there, I came to Schneider Electric, where I've been voting with my badge for the past 15 years now. Came in doing mergers and acquisitions, as the company at that time was very acquisitive, looking at ways to expand on the core of energy management and industrial automation that are really the cornerstones of Schneider Electric. And so in that M&A role, I had an opportunity to see firsthand some of the roles that we saw that digitization, software, resiliency, and efficiency would play later on, and that are really coming to the forefront of what we do today. So this would be major investments that we've made in digital, some acquisitions like Aviva and others that we've made over time. From there, I progressively got closer and closer to the core of the business. So strategy development and execution, channel leadership. We work a lot with electrical distributors, and then ultimately leading to a sales leadership role covering what we call the central region within the US. Where I get really close to what I'm doing today was a couple of years ago, I was asked to take on the CEO role for AutoGrid. So at that time, it was a wholly owned subsidiary of Schneider Electric that we subsequently sold to Uplight, where they are focused on providing edge flexibility solutions like demand response, DERM solutions on the edge, as well as virtual power plants. So now I was just thinking about this, and I realized that I just celebrated my first anniversary in the current role that I have now as CEO of Schneider Electric's digital grid business. And so oftentimes, as I've done throughout my career, I look where are the opportunities? Where is the capital flowing? Where is there innovation? And I'm really excited to have the role that I do now, because grids really are at the center of everything that Schneider Electric does. So in order to make Schneider Electric solutions viable, supporting lives and livelihoods, that really requires for a grid to be thriving and ultimately able to support that. So that's where I've been for the past year. It's been an absolute privilege and honor to lead this group, working alongside really talented people that are mission driven and that are dedicated to solving some of what I think are the biggest challenges facing us today. So that's me in a bit of a nutshell.
Very interesting. So I have to tell you, you are the first person I've spoken to who pretty much grew up in energy. Very cool.
In one way or another, yes.
And so your title itself fascinates me. The term digital grid gets thrown around a lot. And I don't know if everybody really understands what it means. So tell us, what is a digital grid for people who kind of scratch their head out there when they hear it?
That's a great question. And literally, like as you pointed out, this part of our business is called digital grid. So, what I would say is, let me start maybe from the beginning. If you look at some of the underlying technologies that are employed in today's grid, I think that if Edison came and visit us, he would probably recognize a lot of the underlying technology that is still deployed today. In North America, if you think about it, the infrastructure that was put in place probably dates back to the 1950s or 1960s. So we went from a situation where energy was centrally generated, subsequently transmitted, and then ultimately distributed to end users. If we kind of turn the page and start to think about how that has evolved over time, we now have gone from central generation to distributed generation. We have far more participation by prosumers, as we call them within Schneider Electric, that are at once consumers of energy, but also producers to the extent that, for example, you've made an investment in having a photovoltaic on your roof and then solar in your garage, you are therefore a prosumer. And that is at the kind of the micro or the residential level. And then you could scale that all the way up to and including commercial and industrial applications. And so now, as you think about how the market is evolving, you have this multi-directional generation and flows of electricity that require a fundamental rethink of how we are able to manage those at scale and making sure that we're able to ultimately keep the lights on. So, if you think about it in that way, how do you get more out of existing networks? How do you run simulations? How do you reduce complexity? And that's where digital really comes to the forefront. And so, as I think about our portfolio and how we help utilities do that, we start at kind of the beginning of this grid life cycle, starting with asset and environmental management, looking to make sure that you have accurate network models to drive efficiencies, ultimately to drive safety for technicians, for utilities, identify opportunities for predictive maintenance, and then also get in front of things like major event management, which has really come to the forefront, unfortunately. But I'm happy to say that I think there are solutions that we could help provide that mitigate those things. So if you
Hmm.
go a step beyond that, you have things like advanced distribution management systems where you're able to do central monitoring, control, optimization, distributed energy management systems, which we've already kind of referred to, where people are progressively becoming prosumers and having the ability to participate in their energy needs. And then ultimately customer engagement. So it's a really big pool of different technologies. And what I would finish by saying, as you think about other sorts of digital applications, you have AI, which is maybe another word that we'll come back to, but that's another word that's bantied about, where everybody has a different definition of what that is. But if you think about all these things coming together as you go from, let's say, the analog version, to go back to my reflections on where I started my career with Deutsche Bank covering automotives, to now more and more infusing the intelligence that technology enables for us to provide today.
So your title used to be the cutting edge title, digital grid, but now AI is coming on strong.
Indeed.
Yeah, we're certainly talking a lot about AI these days, especially in reference to data centers and how much power they will require. It's a fascinating, controversial issue right now. So when you're promoted to AI CEO, we'll talk again.
I'll be here.
So you mentioned AI, but what are the other sort of big looming issues the energy industry thinks about now concerning the digital grid? What are the sort of problems and challenges, and where do they emanate from?
Let's start first with where we just finished, and that would be with data centers. So there are a few macro trends that we oftentimes hear from the utility and grid operators that we have the privilege of working with daily. And so if I start first with load growth, we went through a period of literally decades where we had more or less stable load, and that is demand. So the amount of electricity that people are requiring of the grid. So what's happened? Most recently, you start to see reshoring of manufacturing. You start to see electrification of homes, electrification of fleets, of ports. And so that started to form an uptick in the amount of energy that was used and ultimately demanding of the grid. what has really created a step change now is the proliferation of data centers, and in particular, those that are working with AI. So, AI, where they're doing training or where they're doing inferencing, requires a tremendous amount of energy, a tremendous amount of energy in order to be able to power all those racks, a tremendous amount of energy in order to be able to do the cooling as all of that technology is being utilized. And so this has really done a step change in terms of the amount of energy that is being used. And to give the listeners a sense of how much this is really increasing, is by 2040, consumption is expected to grow 3.5 times faster than over the prior 50 years. So, really, a significant step change that now grid operators are having to think very creatively about how do we address all of those challenges. So, the first thing is load growth. The second thing I'd point out was aging infrastructure. So, aging infrastructure, I mentioned just a moment ago that a lot of the grid assets that are deployed today were put in place in kind of the mid 1900s. And so right now we're in a situation where anywhere from, let's say, 60 to 70% of all assets today, or let's say some of the major assets like things like conductors slash power lines, transformers, et cetera, are anywhere from, let's say, 25 to 35 years old. So they're nearing the end of their useful life. And at the same time, you start to look, okay, now if all that is true, now you need to find other forms of generation. And so you have one potential solution in distributed energy resources. Yet today, the interconnection queues can be upwards of 5 years. So that basically defers the timeline by which you can have those DERs participate to help out this need of the grid. And a couple last things I'd point out here is that the supply chain also is still pretty extended. And if you look at some critical assets that are out there like transformers, which historically, let's say lead times are in the 18 to 24 months, you start to see those pushed out to 2, 3, and even further years out into the future. And so my conclusion out of all this is that, yes, there needs to be continued investment in hardware and in infrastructure, but non-wire alternatives or grid management software, as one example, is something that absolutely needs to be part of the calculus in addressing some of these challenges that I mentioned.
Because it offers us an opportunity to use those assets more efficiently, correct?
That is 100% correct. And the other thing that I would add to it is being able to extract the most amount, let's say, optimal usage that you can of what's already deployed. But there's also this element of time to power. And so I mentioned on one hand, Schneider Electric is very involved on the grid side, but we are also one of the world's largest producers of secure power and of energy management to data centers. And so what they are very focused on right now is the speed by which they're able to get their sites powered. And so these are different ways in which we're able to do that faster rather than having to kind of stand up, do the permitting required and what have you in order to do the investments in physical infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that that point gets missed a lot in this discussion about the need for power that's arising is that it doesn't necessarily always mean building more power. We've figured out these more virtual or digital ways to use what we have more efficiently. Like virtual power plants, I guess, are one good example. So we don't always need to put a generator on the system. Not that we
Well said.
won't need more generators, but there are other options. So, why isn't all this happening faster, though? This is a form of grid modernization. I mean, there seems to be right now, my impression is there's a lot of consternation in the industry that we're not going to get the power fast enough that's going to be needed. There's concerns about rate increases. It's just this feeling of slowness. I know part of it is simply that we can't build very quickly because of delays in interconnection and some supply chain issues, but other things going on that are slowing up grid mod?
I think so. I'll answer that question in a moment. But the one thing that I want to make sure that I underscore is I don't want to undermine or undersell in any way the fact that utilities are making major investments around the world, right? They're making major investments in order to meet this need because ultimately it's their job to very simply keep the lights on. So that's continuing to happen. If I go and I think about your question very directly, I think we need to remember that in the United States alone, there are more than 3,000 electrical utilities. So it is a major challenge in order to make sure that we're able to spool these up in a way where they're able to address and be able to support this sort of load growth and requirements of some very demanding customers like data centers as one example. I read an article, I think it was Popular Mechanics or somewhere, and they described the US grid as one of the largest machines in the world, requiring constant care, vigilance, and innovation. And I love that descriptor because I think it gives a sense of the amount of interconnectedness that needs to come together in order for it to work in the way that it should. So these are highly complex, mission critical applications. Oftentimes, each utility has its own legacy tech stack. So a tech stack that has developed over time with silos between IT and OT. And so each utility that you work with is very different. So the scale is really large. The applications are very discrete and have kind of grown and built over time. So those are some of the challenges that I would say and why it hasn't happened faster. A couple last things that I think are worth pointing out is you also have a lot of pilots. So you mentioned before, and I mentioned before as part of AutoGrid as one example, is there are lots of pilots, particularly on the technology side. Yet the ability to take those pilots into full scale implementations is something that has been relatively slow from an adoption perspective. And so I think that there are a number of factors that lead to that slowness, to use your word. And I think everybody collectively has a level of impatience only because we see the need for it in order to power our lives and livelihoods. But I think there are some opportunities with things like regulatory support, streamlined frameworks, going from utilities today that are really focused on their rate base. So that means that they're focused on capital expenditures. And can we expand that definition to look instead at CapEx, but to look at capital expenditures as well as operating expenditures in order to be able to think more holistically at what is the full basket of solutions that we might be able to use, whether it's hardware, which would be a clear capital expenditure, or whether it's on the software side, which can sometimes be an operating expense. I think we need to kind of expand some of these definitions in order to be able to really use the full toolbox of solutions that are available to us.
Let me just jump back on this a little bit to understand. So, what is it about these particular these tools in this toolbox? What are we not doing? What do we need to do? How will they improve the situation?
So we talked a little bit about some of the hardware. I think that's
Mhm.
relatively straightforward. What I would add to that is if I go back to the ability to really extract the most amount of value from deployed assets, some of that would be softwares where you're able to monitor in real time how your physical assets are working. So that would be kind of connected products. Another would be around the ability to take all of the distributed assets that are out there. So those aren't owned by the utility, but they're owned by customers or ratepayers. And so thinking more holistically about the ability to create an incentive structure for utilities to consider and use some of those solutions as part of their overall generation calculus. This is what I mean about having a more holistic view of how you might be able to bring to bear not only the assets of the utility, but extending beyond that to the edge to think about other assets that you could potentially bring in for grid services and the like.
That's a great point. I hear that a lot. This issue about utilities not being incentivized or rate structures really not being correct. We have this new technology, but we just haven't really figured out a way to bring it into the utility system in a way that will be financially viable for them. Very interesting point. And of course, we're in murky territory because, as you said, we're talking about 3,000 utilities and we're making generalizations. And so there's all kinds of utilities doing all kinds of different things. But your pilot program comment was really fascinating too. I hear that a lot, that, death by pilots is a common phrase in the energy industry because we have so many pilots. Do we get stuck in pilot phase simply because we lack those financial incentives to encourage utilities to adopt the programs fully? Or are there other things going on there that kind of trap us in that death by a million pilots?
That's an excellent question. I definitely think that there is an incentive structure that needs to be aligned and ultimately take those out of pilots into kind of full scale implementations. So I think that's certainly part of it. I think the other thing that I would add to that is the ability to have clear references. So I'm happy to say Schneider Electric, we've been able to stand up virtual power plants and in some cases kind of turnkey virtual power plants where we've gone out and actually collected the assets that are out there in order to have a certain, let's say, envelope of megawatts that can be then brought as grid service through Uplight. So where I'm going with this is I think there is one, the incentives. And then secondly, again, I come back to the core requirement and mission of a utility, and that's to keep the lights on. So the ability to have clear references where you see that it's something that can be relied upon and that ultimately is something that can be brought to the service of the grid, then I think that it is somewhat de-risked for the second, third, and fourth implementations as utilities look to one another. And that's one thing that I think is interesting. Utilities oftentimes have kind of a defined service territory where they're the only provider of electricity. So you see a lot of benchmarking and sharing of notes of what works and what doesn't work. And so that's what we're really focused on is demonstrating the technology's viability, which has been proven many, many times, and taking that as a reference point on which to build and to say, look, now is the time to take your pilot that is working and really start to focus on how you take that into full scale operation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, not to sound doomsday, but what if we don't move more quickly? What if we don't modernize the grid more quickly? We have all this coming at us, data centers, and as you said, more industrialization, electrification. What are we looking at if we don't make these changes?
Yeah, I'm inherently an optimistic person. So I think we will get to the other side of this, but I don't think that grid operators today don't face any risks. And so you don't need to look very far into the past to see some real challenges. So exposure to more extreme and more frequent weather events is something that can be a challenge, and the ability to be able to quickly predict and or quickly react to some of those, I think is something that could be compromised if we don't leverage some of the forecasting tools, for example, that we have now. Cyber threat is something that is always out there. In the end, this is critical infrastructure. So making sure that we're doing everything that we can to ensure the safety and the continuity of these grids is something that is first and foremost for us. And then ultimately, it will strain the aging infrastructure that we've talked about already. And so these factors together can contribute to more extended service disruptions, as one example. And to give you another fact, as we were looking back at 2024 in North America, extreme weather events accounted for about 80% of all blackouts. So it is a real challenge that we think that we can help address through some of these modernization techniques. Other things that could be challenges as it relates to this would be delays in distributed energy resource contributions, prosumer participation, which we've talked about a little bit already, rising costs for reliable energy. And I think that to bottom line it for you, I think that investing in energy infrastructure, leveraging innovative energy management technologies is a must in order to be able to address the increasing market demand, as well as providing the power needed for the US economy to more effectively and affordably operate.
So, I recently read that you have a product called One Digital Grid. How does that fit in with what we're talking about here? That's a grid modernization technology, correct?
It is. So let me start by the customer back, which I think is always a helpful frame by which to look at some of these things. As we've had conversations with grid operators around the world, there's this dynamic and challenging operating environment around the load growth, distributed generation, regulator and ratepayer pressure for affordability, which we haven't talked about. But I think that that's a real challenge that grid operators need to make sure that this is fair in terms of where the ultimate burden lies in order to be able to modernize the grid. The second thing that we heard from utilities is around disjointed IT and OT systems. So they have their own kind of silos within their organizations. And then ultimately, the lack of an ability to extract value from data rich point solutions. Utilities have a tremendous amount of data, but their ability to be able to extract that data and make actionable insights out of those, I think has been somewhat elusive thus far. So what we've been focused on, and I'll give you an analogy that I think is helpful as I frame it in my own mind. So this evolution of energy management systems has gone from siloed systems to operating systems So if you think about your iPhone, you have a collection of applications, depending on how you use those applications, that are specific to the individual. Same is true with utilities. Now, what our One Digital platform does is it goes one step further from siloed to operating systems to now have a connected ecosystem. And that connected ecosystem allows for us to address far more use cases than we would have in the past. So it solves through a couple of central services, and I'll kind of go through these one by one. The first is we wanted to be able to provide our utility customers with a maximum amount of flexibility. And so that started first with kind of an underpinning objective that we had of being able to provide a hybrid cloud solution, meaning either you could have applications that are hosted on the cloud, or you could have applications that are hosted locally. So again, I come back to the fact that utilities are dealing with mission critical applications. And so some of those they might want to keep on premise, and then others can go into the cloud in order to have kind of this maximum flexibility. The next thing is I talked about before, like these siloed systems or these operating systems. And so we have created as part of this platform the ability to have a grid data hub. You have all of these individual systems that historically were creating data, yet they were all in discrete data estates. So what we're doing is we're pulling all those into one layer, starting first with first party applications of digital grid, and then the ability to subsequently be able to pull in third party applications. And so what this allows for is it allows for all this data to be in one place that can then be used for future use cases, something that we are really excited about. Why is it so important to have third party integrations? The utilities have made lots of tech choices over time. And so what we didn't want is for them to have to replace everything that they have in order to be able to use our platform. And so the ability to have third-party software vendors be able to participate here, we think is really important in order to be able to lower the total cost of ownership as one specific example. And then I'll finish here from a platform perspective I talked about use cases. This is something that I think is really exciting, and that as I think about the ability to do things and address use cases that we aren't thinking about today, is how I think this platform unlocks that. So going back to my iPhone analogy, if you go back 10, 12, whenever the iPhone was introduced, who would have known the amount of ways that you can use that iPhone? So today we could use it to rent a vacant room in somebody's home, to hail a car, to do lots of different things. In a similar way, we think that there are ways to add more and more use cases, either directly from Schneider or third-party vendors or utilities, in order to address their unique needs. And this is something that I'm super excited about. And I think that the first chapter hasn't even been written yet.
That's fascinating. And with AI coming on strong, I'm sure those third-party applications and additional use cases are just going to accelerate and get more sophisticated. So I can definitely see your point in wanting to offer something that could incorporate the new.
Yeah. If you would indulge me for a moment. When we were at Distributech, we showcased one of these examples. And so what we did was we stitched together a number of different sources. So we had digital grid applications. We had Esri applications, which are the GIS provider that gives kind of the topology of a grid. And AI Dash was a vegetation management provider that we work closely with. And what we were able to do was stitch all these things together. And what it allowed for was, in the event of a fire, you're able to identify proactively particular areas where you have assets that need maintenance. And so those could potentially become a failure point in the event of a difficult or a severe storm event. Let's say that that wildfire happens. Now you could start to, how do you employ other parts of your technology stack? Let's take the Esri example, where that is a map, and the map can identify where are the right places to stage first responders. Where are the right places to be able to identify some of the different assets that you might need in order to be able to manage and work through this major event? And so this is where I get really excited. So we were able to, through regularly typed language, you can imagine that there is an operator that's sitting in the operating room. You have all sorts of alarms that are being identified. but you're able to ask it very clear questions. And the examples that we showed was, where is there a fault? And then the AI grid assistant identifies where those faults are. Next question is, where is there a fault, but there is not a fire crew that is deployed? And then it gives you a subset of those that identify of that, where is there not crew that has been dispatched? And so you start to see what could be an extremely chaotic event, the ability to really distill down what are the key questions that I need as an operator in order to be able to address this challenge in real time under stress. And this is an example of something that AI can help that operator work through.
That's fascinating. That's really fascinating. So, given your job, I have to ask you this. What's your vision for where we're heading? What's a fully modernized digital first grid look like? What can it achieve? And not just, for utilities, but for our society at large.
That's a big question. As I said, I'm an incredibly optimistic person. And what I would say is there are a lot of people that are focused on addressing this challenge. And so I firmly believe, and we already have technology solutions. I would argue 60 to 70% of the technology required is available today. So it's less of a question of technology availability and more a question of intent and speed. So to answer your question directly, Elisa, the things that I would say is I can see a future where the grid is intelligent, is adaptive, and is resilient. And it's going to ultimately have to be capable of integrating clean energy at scale. So those distributed energy resources that we've been talking about, I think is absolutely critical. And to be able to respond to disruptions in real time and ultimately empower the consumers with a greater amount of control and transparency. So if I think about the end state here, I think this is something that we can all agree on, regardless of where you sit in the world, where you sit in the United States, is the importance of keeping the lights on from homes, hospitals, businesses, schools. It's foundational to protecting lives and livelihoods. So we at Schneider Electric, the team that I have the privilege of leading, is we're focused on delivering sustainable solutions that ensure resiliency and protects what we think is a right to affordable and safe energy.
Well, I have to tell you, Ruben, after speaking to you, I am feeling more optimistic as well. This is fascinating to see where things are going. Truly appreciate you coming on the Energy Changemakers podcast today to give us this vision.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.